Hello and welcome to Identifying Monsters in Pathfinder 2nd Edition Remastered. In this video we're going to discuss the mechanics involved when a player wants to see what their character knows about a given enemy. Are they weak to fire? Will cold iron hurt them? Did they come from one of the outer planes? Things like that. And it's worth mentioning that although this video is targeted towards identifying monsters, the process that's explained here applies to any recall knowledge check. So the same process could be used to see what a character knows about a coat of arms, about an old tree, or really anything. And as a reminder, this video is again for the Remaster edition. So if your game is using the original Legacy edition of Pathfinder 2nd Edition, then please see the link in the description for a video that covers those rules. When players encounter a creature they don't recognize, or more appropriately, when their characters encounter such a monster, as separating player knowledge from character knowledge is going to be very important to this discussion, they may attempt skill checks to see what information their character knows about the creature. This is a recall knowledge check, requires one action, and can be attempted untrained. When doing so, the player will ask the GM one question such as, can it be reasoned with? What environments does it live in? What's its most notable offensive ability? Is it highly vulnerable or resistant to anything? Or are any of its defenses weak? Ideally, the questions should be phrased using in-universe language, but it's usually acceptable for players to use game language too. For example, most GMs would allow their players to ask, what is its worst saving throw? And then the GM rolls the skill check in secret so the player does not know how well or how poorly they did, or in other words, they don't know how reliable the result is going to be. On a success, the GM answers the question truthfully, but without providing any numbers. For example, if after observing a troll's regeneration ability, the player uses their recall knowledge action and asks, is there any way to negate this regeneration? The GM would roll the check in secret, and on a success answer, you know the troll's regeneration ability can be temporarily deactivated by dealing electricity or fire damage. Also note that the GM may limit the knowledge given according to the proficiency level of the character making the check. For example, an untrained character may not know very obscure information about a target no matter how high they roll. There are no concrete rules for determining what information is granted at each proficiency level, and this will require the GM to make a judgment call regarding what is appropriate information for each proficiency level. On a critical success, the GM answers the question that was asked truthfully and either provides additional information related to that question or allows the player to ask a second question which they will also answer truthfully. The book doesn't provide a lot of guidance for this, but in my game, if a player asks, is it weak to anything, and rolls a success, I would provide what I consider to be the greatest weakness or the most well-known weakness. In the case of this troll, I would tell them that it is weak to fire. And if they rolled a critical success, I would tell them all of the creature's weaknesses. In this case, I would tell them it's weak to fire and electricity. But I wouldn't provide any numbers. I wouldn't tell them that the weaknesses are electricity 10 and fire 10. And on a failed recall knowledge check, the player learns nothing, and on a critical failure, they learn incorrect or misleading information. Maybe they mistake the troll for a marsh giant, and therefore don't know that it has regeneration abilities. This is why it's important to roll the check in secret, so the players don't know if the information is correct. And there may be sometimes you need to remind players that player knowledge and character knowledge should be separate. So if a player knows that the information you give them is false, you may need to remind them that their character believes that it is correct and they should play that character appropriately. But before you can roll those recall knowledge checks, you need to know which skill to use. By default, the skills you use to identify a creature are based on its traits. The table on page 55 of the GM core book spells it all out for you. Arcana is used to identify beasts, constructs, dragons, and elementals. Crafting is used to identify constructs. Nature is used to identify animals, beasts, elementals, fae, fungi, and plants. Occultism is used to identify aberrations, astral beings, dreams, creatures with the ethereal trait, oozes, spirits, and time creatures. Religion is used to identify celestial beings, fiends, monitors such as psychopomps, shades, and undead. And society is used to identify and know details about the various humanoid ancestries that inhabit Galarian, like humans, elves, dwarves, and so on. And note that we're talking about the humanoid trait here, not the creature's shape. A zombie may have 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head, but they're not considered to be, quote, humanoids in game terms. So, for example, if players encounter a manticore, they could use either the Arcana or Nature skills to identify it, since manticores have the Beast trait. In addition, players can also use an appropriate lore skill to identify creatures. So as another example, if you're trying to identify a vampire, you could use either religion or lore undead, or even more specific lore skills like lore vampire. At the GM's discretion, players might also be able to use other related skills. Hags, for example, are humanoids, and therefore you would normally use society to identify them. But hags are also well known for their occult spell use, so a GM might allow occultism in place of society. It's also possible to gain knowledge about a creature using even more skills. This will be entirely up to the GM, but if the character has an ability or skill that they're trying to assess in the target creature, then they might be able to use a skill to see if the target creature has the same ability or to what degree. For example, if a character is trained in athletics and wants to know if they can outrun a monster, they might be able to roll athletics instead of a knowledge skill, but they would use their intelligence modifier for the bonus instead of strength for that check. And a quick pro tip, if you look up the creature using an online resource like PF Easy Tools, it will tell you exactly which skill to roll and its DC. For example, using Recall Knowledge with a Force Troll is a DC 20 society check. Once you know what skill needs to be rolled, the next question is, what DC needs to be beat to score success? This is fairly easy. Simply compare the level of the creature to the DCs by level table found on page 53 of the GM Core book, and then modify by the creature's rarity. Common creatures use the listed DC, increase the DC by 2 for uncommon creatures, by 5 for rare creatures, and by 10 for unique creatures. And then lower the DC if a lore skill is being used instead of one of the general knowledge skills. This reduction is either 2 points lower or 5 points lower at the GM's discretion. For example, Niliths are common 10th level aberrations, so identifying one would call for a DC 27 occultism check. Cyclops are uncommon 5th level humanoids, so it would take a DC 22 society check to identify one of them, and if using the lore Cyclops skill instead of society, the DC may be lowered to 17. Things get a little more tricky when talking about unique creatures. Rules as written, unique creatures have a DC that is 10 higher than what's listed for their level on the table. But I think this is one of those areas where the GM really needs to leverage their own insights. If the creature has the unique tag because they are an individual member of a species like Warble Bumblebrasher is, then by raw, the DC to identify her is 25, 15 for being first level, plus 10 more for having the unique trait. Although not spelled out in the rules, I believe the intention here is for it to be a DC 15 society check to know that you're looking at a goblin, and a DC 25 check to recognize her as a specific goblin named Warble Bumblebrasher. And the GM may lower the DC to know that Warble is a goblin due to the standard goblin being a level -1 creature. Again, this is all up to the GM to make a judgment call. The GM also needs to ask themselves, if Warble is a goblin of great renown in the community, then wouldn't it be easier to identify her? If that's the case, the DC may be lower to know her name, but would likely still be DC 25 to know that she's deadly accurate when throwing her heavy books as ranged weapons. Again, the GM will need to use some common sense and their own interpretations when managing the DCs to identify unique creatures. That's the gist of how to identify a monster. You use recall knowledge with an appropriate skill versus a DC that's based on the creature's level and rarity. If successful, the GM answers one question about it, and if you critically succeed, you either learn extra information related to the question that you asked, or the GM offers to answer another question. But what if that's not enough? What if you need to learn even more information about the creature? You can continue to spend one action and make one skill check, but with two restrictions. First, as soon as a character fails a recall knowledge check, they cannot make any further checks on that subject. At that point, the GM has revealed all the information the character knows about the creature. And second, the DC increases by one difficulty level with every additional check. So, for example, if you succeed your first skill check against a regular DC, the GM answers one question about the monster. If you spend another action, this becomes a hard check, increases the DC by 2, and if successful, the GM answers another question about it. And if that's still not enough information, you can make a third check at +5. If you fail that check, you're done, but if you succeed, then you can make one last check at incredibly hard difficulty with a +10 DC. This is the last check you can make, regardless of success or failure. After you attempt an incredibly hard check, the GM will have revealed all the information you know about the creature. And note that if the character is using a lore skill, then they start at either easy or very easy on this chart. This is where that -2 and -5 reduction to DC I previously mentioned comes from, which means you have more potential checks that can be made with lore skills, as it will take a person starting at very easy 6 recall knowledge actions to max out their knowledge of a creature versus 4 attempts when using a general knowledge skill and a standard DC. And since this is for the Remaster edition, let's briefly review the changes from the Legacy edition. The biggest change in this remastered version is the player asks a specific question and gets a specific answer. In the Legacy edition, if they rolled a success, then the GM needed to decide what the most commonly known fact about the monster was and share that. And on repeated attempts, the GM would need to decide what the next most well-known fact about the monster was, and so on. This process could be frustrating for GMs because it forced them to sort of rank all of the monster's stats from best known to least known without any guidance, and it could also be frustrating for players because they could receive information that they didn't want or need. In the new version, the players ask specific questions, and that helps ensure they'll be rewarded with applicable information. So there you have it, the rules for identifying monsters in other applications of Recall Knowledge in Pathfinder 2nd Edition Remastered. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments, and I want to take a quick moment to thank everyone who supports me and this channel, whether that be by leaving your comments, clicking the like button, subscribing to the channel, buying a super thanks, or subscribing to the Patreon. I really appreciate all you do to support me. With that, thanks for watching, take care, and happy gaming.